There is a base in central Israel that does not appear on most tourist maps. You will not find it on a casual search. Locals know it by proximity, the sound of jets overhead, the restricted roads, the fences that do not invite questions. Telnof Air Base sits in the flatlands south of Tel Aviv, and inside its perimeter, Israel keeps some of its most capable weapons in the sky. The F-15 fighters stationed there are not just aircraft. They are classified systems. Every component, every modification, every technical upgrade mapped in documents that Israel's enemies would pay almost anything to read. Iran paid almost nothing. What if the most dangerous spy inside one of Israel's most fortified air bases was never trained as a spy? What if the breach that handed Iran technical secrets about Israel's F-15 fleet didn't come from a deep cover operative, a forged identity, or a decade-long infiltration, but from a chat message sent to a teenager who needed money? His name was Sagi Haik. He was 19 years old. He was stationed at Telnof, assigned to the technical maintenance unit responsible for the base's F-15 fleet. His job required precision, responsibility, and security clearance. Every day, he worked around systems that Israel spent billions of dollars developing and protecting. He had access to areas of the base that most personnel on that installation would never see. He was not an officer. He was not a strategist. He was a conscript doing his mandatory military service, a teenager in uniform, responsible for some of the most sensitive hardware in the Middle East. In the months leading into what Israel would call Operation Roaring Lion, Sagi Haik received a message. The message did not announce itself as Iranian intelligence. It never does. There was no trench coat, no dead drop, no foreign accent asking him to meet in a parking garage. There was only a screen, a message, and on the other side of it someone who already knew enough about him to ask the right questions. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the method. Iran's intelligence apparatus, particularly operatives linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, had spent years building what analysts describe as high-volume digital recruitment infrastructure. The concept is brutally simple. You do not look for a spy. You look for someone who is stressed, underpaid, and reachable. You send hundreds of messages across encrypted apps, social media platforms, sometimes gaming networks. You identify young servicemen and women through publicly visible details: a tagged photo, a mention of military service, an account that says enough without saying too much. Most messages get ignored, some get reported, a small number get answered. The handlers are patient. They are not making a single high-stakes approach. They are running a probability operation. Volume is the strategy. And somewhere in the volume, there is always someone who, at exactly the wrong moment in their life, picks up the phone. Sagi Haik picked up the phone. The first contact would not have felt dangerous. It rarely does. A question about life on base. A friendly tone. Perhaps someone claiming to be a researcher, a journalist, a foreign national with an interest in military technology, or simply a stranger offering easy money for easy answers. The ask would have been small, the kind of thing that feels more like a survey than a crime. What aircraft do you work on? What is the general layout of your unit? Nothing that felt classified, nothing that felt like betrayal, and there would have been payment. Small at first, sent through channels designed to feel informal, cryptocurrency transfers, amounts modest enough to spend without explaining. This is the architecture of the first lie. It is built to feel like nothing. Because if the first ask felt like espionage, no one would say yes. The entire method depends on the target not recognizing what they have entered until the door behind them has already closed. By the time the requests escalate, by the time the questions stop being general and start being specific, technical, classified, the target has already accepted money, already answered questions, already done something they cannot undo. The lie that Sagi Haik told himself in those early weeks was the same lie every recruited asset tells: this is minor. This doesn't count. No one is being hurt. The requests escalated. They always do. What began as general questions became specific asks. Photographs, documents, the kind of material that exists on classified registers, that requires sign-outs, that leaves administrative trails inside a military system designed to track exactly these movements. F-15 engine diagrams, technical system blueprints, infrastructure details of the base itself. Hake was a maintenance technician. He had legitimate reasons to handle exactly this material as part of his daily duties. This is what made him valuable. Not his rank, not his connections, his access. A handler sitting in Tehran or Damascus or some safe house across an unmarked border had found a young man with his hands on the technical heart of Israel's F-15 operations, and that young man was answering messages. At some point, Hake brought in someone else. Asaf Shitrit was 21, from a town called Beit Oved, also a technician, also at Telnof, also now inside the same network. How exactly Hake drew him in remains partially sealed. What is established is that it happened, that the handler's reach inside the base doubled not through a new digital recruitment but through personal trust. Hake vouched for someone. Shitrit stepped through the same door. Two people now carried the secret. Two people now had to maintain a separate version of themselves, at work, at home, among friends, during every routine interaction with the Israeli military apparatus they were betraying. Neither of them had been trained to do this. The second unresolved problem was structural, and it was already building before either man fully understood it. Every deception that involves two people is twice as fragile. Two phones, two payment trails, two sets of behavior that had to stay synchronized and invisible. Two young men, neither of them intelligence professionals, neither of them equipped with the psychological tools that long-term undercover operatives spend years developing. The ability to compartmentalize completely, to show nothing, to never let the mask slip in a moment of stress or exhaustion or ordinary human distraction. On a military base, you are watched, not always formally, but the culture of a military installation is close quarters. People notice. A soldier who starts spending differently. A technician who lingers in a restricted area slightly longer than the task requires. A person whose behavior, over time, develops a quality that colleagues cannot quite name, but cannot quite ignore either. 8 people, it would later emerge, had seen something. 8 additional soldiers who, at some point, became aware that something around them was not what it appeared to be. What they did with that awareness, whether they rationalized it, suppressed it, or simply chose not to see, is a question that would eventually become part of the investigation. But in those months, while Hake and Shitrit were passing documents and photographs and base details to a handler whose real name they may never have known, those 8 people stayed silent. That silence was its own kind of cover. Unplanned, uncoordinated, and more durable in some ways than the deception at the center of it. The handler, meanwhile, was not finished with Sagi Hake. The money was one thing. The information was another. But somewhere in the escalating months of this operation, the asks shifted into territory that Hake had not anticipated when he answered the first message. The handler wanted him to travel, to leave Israel, cross a border, and make physical contact with the network in one of the Arab countries, the specific location still undisclosed. Training, the handler said. An expansion of the relationship, and then find more people, inside Telnof, inside the IAF, more sources, more access, more penetration of the institution that had given Hake his uniform and his clearance and his daily proximity to the machines Iran most wanted to understand. Hake was no longer just a passive source. He was being asked to become something more operational, more permanent, more difficult to walk back from. Whether he understood, in that moment, what he had already become, or what accepting these new tasks would make him, is the question this story turns on. Because the handler already knew the answer, and Sagi Hake, 19 years old, a technician at a base that does not appear on most public maps, was about to find out what it costs to be useful to people who do not care whether you survive the usefulness. What exactly did Iran ask him to do next, and why did his answer to that question change everything? The handler's next message did not come immediately. That gap, the silence between asks, is itself a technique. It creates anticipation. It makes the target feel the absence of the relationship, which by this point had its own gravity. Money had been received. Tasks had been completed. A pattern had been established. And patterns, once they exist, feel like obligations. When the message came, it arrived as something different. Not a document request, not a photograph. The handler wanted Hake to cross a border. To leave Israel, travel to one of the Arab countries, the specific destination still sealed in the indictment, and make physical contact with the network. In person. On foreign soil. Away from the base, away from the cover of routine, away from every familiar anchor that had made the previous months feel manageable. This is where the operation changed shape, and this is the moment where Hake, almost certainly, felt the first real weight of what he had stepped into. There is a psychological threshold in every recruited asset's experience that intelligence professionals call the point of no safe return. It is not the moment you first accept money. It is not the first time you photograph a classified document. It is the moment the ask becomes so large that completing it would transform you into something categorically different, and refusing it would require you to explain everything that came before. Hake was standing at that threshold. The Iranian handler, the same voice that had spent months being patient, friendly, financially generous, carefully calibrated to feel like a business relationship, turned. And what emerged from behind that patient facade was not a partner. It was a controller. This is the moment the first lie fully reveals itself in reverse. Go back to the beginning, the friendly message, the small ask, the modest payment, the tone of mutual benefit. All of it was architecture. All of it was designed to reach exactly this moment, when Hake had already done enough that the handler could say, without exaggeration, "You cannot tell anyone what you have done without destroying yourself. Your family knows nothing. Keep it that way, or they will know everything, in a way you cannot control." The deception was never about Hake deceiving Israel. It was about Iran deceiving Hake. He had believed, at some level, that he was in a transaction. Voluntary, bounded. Something he could exit when he chose. The threats made clear that the transaction had always been a fiction. He had been a target, not a partner. And the handler's patience was not warmth. It was investment, now being collected. Asaf Shitrit knew some of this. How much, and when, is one of the unresolved fractures at the center of this case. Shitrit was 21. He had been brought in by someone he knew, not by a stranger on the internet. That distinction matters psychologically. When Hake recruited him, when he vouched for the operation, framed the handler, described the arrangement, he did so through the lens of someone who had already normalized what he was doing. The initial pitch Shitrit received was not work for Iranian intelligence. It was almost certainly something smaller. Something that sounded like what Hake had told himself in the beginning. But Shitrit was now inside a network he had not built and could not fully see. He did not have the handler's direct relationship. He did not have the full operational picture. He had a friend who had brought him into something, and a growing awareness that the something was larger and more dangerous than the entry point had suggested. At some point between the escalation of the asks and the emergence of the threats, there was a conversation. Not a formal meeting. Not a structured debrief. Something more like what happens between two people who have made a shared mistake and are beginning to understand its dimensions in the dark. The question on the table, even if it was never stated this plainly, was whether to stop. Stopping, in theory, meant several things. It meant going to Israeli security services, to the Shin Bet, to military police, to someone with the authority to handle what they had done and potentially manage the fallout. It meant confessing months of classified document transfers, photograph deliveries, base infrastructure disclosures, all of it, to people whose job was to treat exactly this kind of confession as a criminal matter. It meant the end of their military service. It meant criminal charges. It meant their families finding out not through a handler's threat but through an arrest, a courtroom, a newspaper. It meant that everything they had built, their reputations, their futures, the ordinary lives they had presumably imagined for themselves after service, would be restructured permanently around what they had done in these months. And it meant that even if they confessed everything, they could not undo the documents already passed, could not retrieve the schematics, could not undeliver the photographs. The damage to Israel's F-15 program, whatever that damage actually amounted to, existed in Iranian hands regardless of what Haik and Shitrit chose to do next. Telling the truth would have been safer than continuing. But telling the truth was not actually safe. It was just a different kind of destruction, arriving sooner. So they continued. This is where the case develops a quality that intelligence analysts and prosecutors both find difficult to categorize neatly. The operation was not motivated by ideology, and it was not maintained by courage. It was maintained by the same force that started it, the need to avoid a worse outcome than the current one. Every week they didn't confess made confession harder. Every additional task made the ledger longer. Every payment received deepened the complicity that made walking away feel impossible. Heck, and the deception that had started as a financial arrangement had become, over months, a structural feature of both men's lives. Something they organized their daily behavior around. Something that shaped how they spoke, what they said, where they looked. On a base full of people trained to follow security protocols, two men were now carrying something that had no protocol. There was no handbook for their situation. There was no procedure that helped them. There was only the next message and the decision made again each time to answer it. What they did not know, what neither of them could have known, was that the apparatus designed to catch exactly this kind of operation had already begun to move. The Shin Bet does not announce investigations. It does not send warnings. Its counterintelligence function operates in the same invisible register that Iran's recruitment methodology uses, patiently, structurally, building a picture from fragments that individually mean nothing, but collectively become undeniable. The Iranian digital recruitment pattern was not a secret to Israeli intelligence. The methodology, online approach, cryptocurrency payment, document escalation, coercion, had been documented across multiple previous cases. Analysts had built behavioral and financial signatures around it. Not every case resulted in a prosecution, but every case added resolution to the picture of how Iran operated inside Israeli society and its military. At some point, a thread in this case became visible. Not because of a single dramatic mistake, not because someone talked, because the pattern of behavior, financial, administrative, physical, had drifted far enough from normal that it could be read. The base's information security infrastructure, payment trail analysis, behavioral signals that Haik and Shitrit had no training to suppress because they had never been told they needed to. The investigation that would eventually produce criminal charges was already running in the background while both men continued their duties, maintained their routines, and kept answering messages from a handler who was, himself, almost certainly already aware that the window of the operation was narrowing. And then the handler made the largest ask of all, the ask that neither man was willing to fulfill. Weapons, tasks involving weapons, the exact nature still classified in public filings, but the category unmistakable. This was not a document, not a photograph, not travel to a foreign country for training. This was operational, physical, something with consequences that neither Haik nor Shitrit could distance themselves from by telling themselves the information was harmless, that no one was being directly hurt, that they were just answering questions. Both men refused, and the handler went silent. The sudden silence after months of sustained contact is its own form of pressure. It removes the routine. It removes the income. It removes the strange, distorted sense of relationship that had formed over the course of the operation. The only people in the world who knew what Haik and Shitrit were, and who had been in their way, consistent. What neither man apparently understood in that silence was this: the handler going quiet was not the end of the operation. It was the handler deciding that the assets were no longer worth protecting. and that what had already been extracted was sufficient. The two young men at Telnof, standing in the silence after the handler stopped writing, were not free. They were simply no longer useful. What Hake did next, the decision he made in that silence, is the thing that would define the final shape of everything that followed. And it was the one decision, of all the decisions he had made across these months, that he made entirely alone. The silence lasted long enough that Hake began to interpret it as permission. This is the misjudgment that defines the execution phase of almost every compromised asset's story. Not the dramatic error, not the moment of obvious recklessness, but the quiet, reasonable-seeming conclusion drawn from incomplete information. The handler had stopped writing. The tasks had stopped coming. The threats had arrived and then, after the refusal, receded. And in the absence of pressure, the human mind does what it always does. It looks for a narrative that allows normal life to resume. Hake told himself, at some level, that it was over. It was not over, but the belief that it was changed how he moved through the following days, and that change in behavior, subtle as it was, became part of the pattern that investigators were already mapping from the other side of the wall. What he actually did, in the silence, was reach back. Not to confess. Not to a superior officer, not to a security officer on base. Not to anyone positioned to absorb what had happened and manage it through an official channel. He reached back toward the handler, toward the same encrypted line that had delivered the threats, the money, the escalating asks, the final request he had refused. The reason, as established in the eventual indictment, was financial. The payments had become structural. Not a windfall, a dependency. The texture of his daily life had reorganized around their presence, and their absence created a deficit that was both practical and psychological. He was not reaching back because he wanted to continue the operation. He was reaching back because he did not know how to be what he had been before it started. This distinction between wanting to spy and being unable to stop is one that the legal system does not formally recognize. The charges do not account for the psychological architecture that Iran spent months constructing around him. But it is the distinction that explains why the silence did not become confession, why the refusal did not become extraction, why a young man who had just told his handler no found himself typing a message in the direction of the people who had threatened his family. Shitrit's position in this phase is harder to trace from public filings, and deliberately so. What is established is that Shitrit's involvement was not continuous across the full operational timeline, that his entry into the network was specific, task-bound, connected to particular operations rather than the sustained relationship that defined Hake's role. This matters because it means Shitrit's experience of this phase was structurally different. He was not managing a months-long handler relationship. He was managing the knowledge of what he had done and what Hake was still doing. That is a different kind of weight. Not the weight of active operation, but the weight of witness, knowing that something is continuing, that the person who brought you into it is still inside it, and that your own silence about all of it makes you complicit in everything that follows. There was almost certainly a conversation in this period. Perhaps more than one. Perhaps conducted in the kind of careful, indirect language that people use when they cannot say the true thing directly. References that only the other person would understand. Silences that carry more information than the words around them. Two men on the same base, in the same unit, carrying the same secret, trying to determine whether the other one was about to do something that would change both their situations without warning. This is the false start. Not a dramatic break, not a confrontation, a series of moments where extraction felt possible, where the shape of a different choice became briefly visible and then closed again before it could be acted on. The incorrect assumption playing out across this phase was one both men shared, and it was about the nature of the investigation running parallel to their lives. They assumed, if they thought about it at all, that discovery would be loud, that it would arrive with urgency, a sudden summons, a search, a confrontation, where the routine of base life, the physical demands of technical maintenance work, The ordinary social texture of living among fellow soldiers created a version of normalcy that felt, however briefly, like it might be permanent. This is the cruelest feature of the psychological trap that had been constructed around both men. The moments of relief were not real, but they felt real. And each time relief arrived, it made the return of pressure harder to absorb because it confirmed that normal was still possible, still imaginable, still something worth protecting. Which meant that the next message, if it came, would be answered from inside a man who had just spent days believing he was free. The near abort in this phase was not a decision. It was a moment. There was a point, reconstructible from the behavioral record, even if not explicitly documented in public filings, where Hake's conduct on base created friction significant enough that a security interaction became possible. Not an interrogation. Not an accusation. The kind of routine administrative moment that military installations generate constantly. A supervisor's question, an inventory discrepancy, a request to account for time or access in some minor particular. The answer he gave was true enough to pass. It did not collapse anything. The moment resolved without consequence visible to anyone except Hake himself, who had just felt, for the first time, the physical experience of the cover being tested in real time. What he did not know, could not have known, was whether that moment was routine or whether it was investigative. Whether the person asking already had answers and was checking his response against them, or whether it was genuinely administrative, with no knowledge of what lay underneath. This uncertainty is what near-aborts feel like from the inside. Not a close call you can measure. A moment where you cannot determine whether you survived it or whether surviving it was itself the trap. He kept going. The final operative act in this phase was not dramatic. It rarely is. A transfer, a photograph, a document that moved from a classified register into a channel that led out of Israel and into the hands of people building a technical understanding of the F-15 systems that Israel depended on to maintain air superiority over its adversaries. The material was handled the same way it had been handled every time before, carefully, through the infrastructure the handler had established, in a window designed to minimize detection risk. From the outside, it looked like routine. From the inside, it felt like routine. The repetition of the act had sanded away whatever moral friction it once generated. What had been transgression had become procedure. This is the most dangerous phase of any compromised assets operation, not the beginning, when fear is high and caution is operative, but the middle distance when the act has been normalized and the handler's methodology has done its work so thoroughly that betrayal no longer requires a decision. It simply requires showing up. And Sagi Hake showed up, 19 years old, a technician, a conscript, a young man who had answered a message months ago and had not, since then, found a single moment where the cost of stopping was lower than the cost of continuing. He kept showing up until the morning he didn't have to anymore. Not because he had found the exit, because the exit had found him. The arrest did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a closing of space. This is how counterintelligence operations end, not with a dramatic confrontation at the gate, not with a chase or a standoff, but with a gradual narrowing of options that the target experiences as pressure without being able to name its source. For Hake, the days immediately before the formal action would have carried a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has never been inside it. The sense that something has changed in the environment around you. That the routine is still in place, but the routine is no longer real. That the people who usually seem not to notice you are noticing you in a way that looks exactly like not noticing you. The Shin Bet does not announce its arrival. When the arrests came in April 2026, they did not come in isolation. That is the first thing to understand about the fallout. The operation that took down Hake and Shitrit was not a simple apprehension of two soldiers. It was the visible surface of a much larger institutional reckoning, one that had already begun before either man was formally charged. The Telnof base commander was summoned to a clarification meeting with the Shin Bet, not after the charges. around the same time. This timing matters because it signals that the institutional failure being examined was not limited to two individuals. It encompassed command culture, security oversight, and the series of administrative gaps that had allowed classified document access to be used as an intelligence channel for months without triggering a formal alert. A mandatory information security briefing was held for all personnel on the base. Every soldier, every technician, every maintenance worker who shared a unit with men who had been passing F-15 schematics to a foreign intelligence service during an active military operation. The briefing was not punitive. It was procedural, but its existence communicated something that procedure alone cannot fully carry. This happened here, among you, and no one stopped it. The eight additional soldiers under investigation for allegedly knowing about the espionage activity and failing to report it. This number, which emerged alongside the charges against Hake and Shitrit, is the detail that transforms the case from an individual criminal story into an institutional one. 8 people who had seen something, who had noticed a behavioral pattern, or been told something, or been present for a moment that did not fit the shape of normal military life, and who had made the decision, conscious or otherwise, to absorb it into their silence. Their silence was not malicious in all probability. It was the silence of people who recognize that reporting carries costs, disruption, suspicion, the social consequence of naming a colleague, the bureaucratic weight of initiating something you cannot control once it starts. These are not noble calculations, but they are human ones. And they are the calculations that allow operations like this one to survive far longer than they should. The irony embedded in this part of the fallout is direct. The deception at the center of the case, Hake and Shitrit's months-long maintenance of a false version of themselves, was partly sustained by the social deception around it. A collective agreement, unspoken and uncoordinated, to not fully see what was visible. 8 people whose silence became the outer wall of an intelligence operation neither of them had agreed to join. Tie the fallout to the beginning, and the architecture of the entire case becomes visible. Iran's recruitment methodology, the high-volume digital approach, the small initial ask, the gradual escalation, was designed specifically to exploit the gap between what military security systems monitor and what they cannot. Administrative logs track document access. Financial surveillance tracks unusual payment patterns. Behavioral monitoring tracks deviations from established routine. But none of these systems can monitor the decision made in a private moment, on a personal phone, by a person who has not yet done anything that registers. The door was not forced. It was opened from the inside in a moment that generated no data, and the fallout from that moment extended in both directions. Forward, into the arrests, the charges, the institutional reckoning at Telnof. And backward, into every document already passed, every photograph already transmitted, every piece of base infrastructure already mapped in an Iranian intelligence file that no prosecution can now retrieve or erase. The strategic consequences of what Iran obtained through this operation are measured not in the documents themselves, but in their second-order value. F-15. Technical schematics in Iranian hands means engineers, Iranian or Russian or Chinese, or proxies operating in any of Iran's partner networks, now have a detailed technical map of systems they have been studying from the outside for decades. The value is not immediate. Intelligence rarely works immediately. The value is in the derivations, what can be understood about Israeli modifications, what vulnerabilities become visible at the engineering level, what countermeasures become possible when you know not just what a system does, but how it is built. The photographs of base infrastructure mean that Telnof is no longer opaque to adversary planning. Not fully, not in the way it was before. Attack planning, targeting analysis, operational preparation for scenarios involving that base, all of it is now conducted with a level of granular knowledge that Iran did not previously possess. The intelligence on senior officials, Halavi, Ben-Gvir, others, means that Iran's targeting apparatus now holds verified, current information on individuals whose identities and movements are supposed to be protected. Whether that information has already been passed through the network into operational planning is not knowable from public filings. What is knowable is that it exists, that it traveled from Telnof to somewhere outside Israel's borders, and that it cannot be unlearned. The personal cost lands differently for each of the people touched by this case, but it lands permanently for all of them. Sagi Haik faces charges that include aiding the enemy in wartime, passing information to the enemy, and assisting contact with a foreign agent. He is 19 years old. The case is being heard in the Central District Court in Lod. The legal outcome of the trial has not yet concluded at the time of this account, but the charge of treason was being considered, a charge that carries the most severe consequences available in Israeli military law. Asaf Shitrit, 21, faces related charges tied to his involvement in specific operations within the network. Neither of them will complete their military service in the way they would have without the first message. Neither of them will return to the version of their lives that existed before they answered it. The financial dependency that kept the operation running, the reason Haik reached back toward the handler in the silence, produced almost nothing measurable against what it cost. The payments were modest. The consequences are not. The 8 soldiers under investigation face a different, less defined kind of reckoning, one without the clarity of formal charges but with its own weight. They will carry the knowledge of what their silence covered. Military careers altered. Security clearances reviewed. The institutional trust that military service is built on, fractured in ways that may not be legally actionable but are professionally permanent. Iran's handler is, in all probability, already running the next operation. The infrastructure was not disrupted by these arrests. The methodology was not exposed in ways that require rebuilding. It was already publicly documented in previous cases. The digital recruitment pipeline that reached into Telnof and found Sagi Haik is the same pipeline operating across Israeli military social networks right now, this week, sending messages to people who have not yet decided whether to respond. This is the structural consequence that no prosecution fully addresses. 2 people were caught. The method that found them continues, and somewhere in the space between a young soldier's financial anxiety and an encrypted message from an unknown sender, the next operation is already in its early phase, patient, small, asking nothing that feels like a crime. That is what makes this case not an aberration. It is a proof of concept. Iran found an open door inside one of Israel's most fortified military installations, not through sophisticated tradecraft, not through years of deep cover preparation, but through a probability operation run from a distance, at low cost, with a patience built entirely on the knowledge that the target would deceive themselves far more effectively than any handler could. The base is still there. The jets are still flying, but something that cannot be restored was taken from that installation across those months, and the most accurate name for it is not a document or a photograph or a schematic. It is the assumption that the perimeter was enough. If this case raised questions you didn't expect, that's the point. Subscribe to Hidden Ops for more operations that were never supposed to be understood from the outside. New episodes every week.